Hello students, today we'll start with the topic oogenesis. What is oogenesis? Formation of egg in females is known as oogenesis. Children, spermatogenesis starts in males at puberty, but oogenesis starts in female during fetal life. It starts in female during fetal life itself. So first we will discuss the schematic representation of oogenesis, then we will discuss it in detail. So, ovaries in females are lined by germinal epithelium. The cells of germinal epithelium are diploid and they give rise to egg. Some cells of germinal epithelium grow in size and behave as egg mother cell or oogonia, and they are diploid 2N. These oogonia increase their number through mitosis. Then some of these oogonia differentiate to enter into the meiotic cycle, to enter into the meiosis. The oogonia which enter into the meiotic cycle are known as primary oocytes. They are known as primary oocytes. They are also diploid. This primary oocyte enters into meiosis 1, but this meiosis 1 is not completed. It is arrested at diplotin phase of prophase 1. Children, what I have told you, that primary oocyte enters into the meiosis 1 during fetal life itself, but this meiosis 1 is not completed. It is arrested at diplotin phase of prophase 1. So this remains, meiosis 1 remains arrested till puberty. This meiosis 1 remains arrested till puberty. The process from oogonia to meiosis 1, which is arrested, occurs in fetal life. During childhood, this meiosis 1 remains arrested, but when the puberty age is reached, this meiosis 1 is completed. This meiosis 1 is completed and primary oocyte changes into secondary oocyte. Meiosis 1 is completed, two cells are formed, one is bigger in size and one is very small in size. The smaller cell is known as first polar body. This is known as first polar body. It is also haploid and secondary oocyte is also haploid. Now, this secondary oocyte again enters into meiosis 2. It enters into meiosis 2, but this meiosis 2 is arrested at metaphase 2. This meiosis 2 is arrested at metaphase 2. Egg is released from the ovary in secondary oocyte stage. Egg is released from the ovary in secondary oocyte stage and it remains arrested at meiosis 2 at metaphase 2. This meiosis 2 is completed after fertilization. When sperm enters the egg, then the second meiotic division will be completed. So meiosis 2 is arrested and secondary oocyte is released from the ovary. I have written here ovulation occurs at this stage. When sperm enters the secondary oocyte, then meiosis 2 is completed. That is, meiosis 2 is completed after fertilization. After fertilization, egg or ovum is formed and second polar body will be released. This ovum will fuse with the nucleus of the sperm to form the zygote. So, oogonia are present in the fetal life. They differentiate to form primary oocyte. Primary oocyte enters into the meiosis 1, that is meiosis 1, and meiosis 1 is arrested at prophase 1 diplotin stage. This remains arrested till puberty. After reaching the age of puberty, meiosis 1 is completed and secondary oocyte is formed. Ovulation occurs at secondary oocyte stage, and when this secondary oocyte also enters into meiosis 2. But meiosis 2 remains arrested at metaphase 2. Meiosis 2 is completed on the arrival of the sperm. When meiosis 2 is completed, second polar body and ovum are formed. This ovum fuses with the nucleus of the sperm to form the zygote. Now children, I have shown here the TS of ovary. In this diagram, I have shown that the primary oocyte and secondary oocyte exist in the form of follicles. So what are follicles? First we'll learn that. In female, meiosis occurs in fetal life, but it is not completed. So primary oocyte remains as such till puberty. So it has to be protected. Primary oocyte has to be protected. So primary oocyte is surrounded by supporting cells. They are surrounded by supporting cells or granulosa cells or follicular cells. When primary oocyte is surrounded by granulosa cells or supporting cell, then this structure formed is known as primary follicle. This structure is known as primary follicle. So primary oocyte remains protected in the ovary till puberty in the primary follicle form. When this primary follicle gets surrounded by theca cells, this primary follicle now gets surrounded by the theca cells, and these theca cells are also derived from the stroma. This part of the ovary is known as stroma and outer peripheral part is known as cortex. So theca cells are derived from the stroma. So primary follicle gets surrounded by another layer of cells which are known as theca cell. And now the follicle is known as secondary follicle. Now the follicle is known as secondary follicle. These follicle cells or granulosa cell will secrete some nutritive fluid. Will secrete the nutritive fluid to nourish this primary oocyte. Just like in males, Sertoli cells nourish the sperms, similarly in females, these granulosa cells secrete some fluid to nourish the primary oocyte. This fluid is accumulated in a space, so this fluid will occupy the space. This fluid formed by the granulosa cells will occupy the space. See, this fluid which is secreted by granulosa cells will occupy the space, and this fluid filled cavity is known as antrum. This fluid filled cavity is known as antrum. This antrum has liquor folliculi. This antrum has liquor folliculi because the fluid or liquor is secreted by the follicle cells. This theca cell also grow in number. These theca cells also grow in number and form multiple layers. Theca cells or theca is also distinguished into theca interna and theca externa. So first the primary follicle was there. Primary follicle has only granulosa cell. When theca cells were added to primary follicle, it became secondary follicle. When granulosa cells secrete a fluid called liquor folliculi and it occupies the space, when the follicle has fluid filled cavity, then it becomes the tertiary follicle. So tertiary follicle now grows and antrum also increases in size. Only a stalk of granulosa cells remain attached to the primary oocyte called cumulus oophorus. This is only for competition, this point. Only a stalk of granulosa cells remain attached to the primary oocyte called cumulus oophorus. Primary oocyte also matures into secondary oocyte. Primary oocyte now puberty is reached and primary oocyte gets matured into secondary oocyte. When secondary oocyte is formed, then this tertiary follicle is known as mature or Graafian follicle. When this primary oocyte at puberty changes into secondary oocyte, then this tertiary follicle will be known as mature or Graafian follicle. In addition to this, secondary oocyte also secretes a non-cellular membrane around it, which is glycoproteinaceous in nature and is called zona pellucida. Secondary oocyte secretes a non-cellular layer around itself, which is glycoproteinaceous in nature and it is known as zona pellucida. When the follicle grows in size, this mature follicle grows in size, a fibrous layer is formed outside. Therefore, theca is distinguished in two parts, theca externa and theca interna. Theca externa is fibrous and theca interna is cellular. So, a follicle containing secondary oocyte and the follicle which has theca distinguished into two parts, theca externa and theca interna, is known as Graafian follicle. This stage is called Graafian follicle. Children, note down. Graafian follicle has secondary oocyte. Graafian follicle has zona pellucida. Graafian follicle has theca in differentiated form, that is theca externa and theca interna. Theca externa is fibrous and theca interna is cellular. So I am going to summarize this whole process. See what happens. In females, oogenesis starts during the fetal life. Primary oocytes are formed, which are differentiated cells of oogonium, and they have entered into the meiosis 1. But meiosis 1 is not completed. It is arrested at diplotin stage. This primary oocyte has to be protected till puberty. Therefore, it is surrounded by granulosa cells. So, primary oocyte surrounded by granulosa cell is known as primary follicle. Now, this primary follicle is surrounded by theca cells, which are derived from stroma. This stage is called secondary follicle. Now, this primary oocyte has two layers. One is granulosa cell and one is theca cells, one theca layer. These follicular cells now secrete some fluid to nourish this primary oocyte, and this fluid will occupy some space. Therefore, a fluid-filled cavity is formed. When fluid-filled cavity is formed, then the follicle now is known as tertiary follicle. Now the follicle is known as tertiary follicle. At puberty, the primary oocyte in tertiary follicle completes its meiosis 1 to change into secondary oocyte. So, in tertiary follicle, primary oocyte changes to secondary oocyte at puberty. Plus, what happens? Theca gets differentiated into two parts, theca externa and theca interna. Plus, secondary oocyte also secretes a non-cellular glycoproteinaceous layer around it, which is known as zona pellucida. These three changes make tertiary follicle into Graafian follicle. So, Graafian follicle has secondary oocyte, it has zona pellucida, it has theca layer differentiated into two parts. Now, this Graafian follicle ruptures to release secondary oocyte, which is arrested at metaphase 2. This I have told you. Graafian follicle ruptures to release secondary oocyte, which is arrested at metaphase 2, and this meiosis 2 will be completed on the arrival of the sperm. Rupturing of Graafian follicle is called release of ovum or secondary oocyte. This rupturing of Graafian follicle is called release of ovum or oocyte. See children, I have shown various stages here, and this diagram is very important from the board point of view. This can be asked in 5 marks. This is drawn in NCERT and you have to practice it in your notebooks. So, this is primary follicle. Primary follicle is surrounded by only granulosa cells. When theca cells also surrounded, then it becomes secondary follicle. When fluid-filled cavity comes, then it becomes tertiary follicle. Mature follicle has theca externa, theca interna, zona pellucida and secondary oocyte. Then this Graafian follicle ruptures and releases secondary oocyte. But the remaining part of the Graafian follicle does not disintegrate. This remaining part of the Graafian follicle, after releasing secondary oocyte, again changes into a yellow body called Corpus Luteum. After releasing secondary oocyte, this empty Graafian follicle is called Corpus Luteum. This Corpus Luteum, the other name of Corpus Luteum is yellow body, and it secretes the hormone progesterone. If pregnancy occurs, if fertilization takes place and implantation of the zygote takes place in the uterus, this Corpus Luteum will exist for at least 3 months in the pregnancy. After that, it will disintegrate. But if fertilization does not take place, then this Corpus Luteum will change into Corpus albicans. This Corpus Luteum changes into Corpus albicans and disintegrates. Corpus albicans do not secrete progesterone. Corpus luteum is also known as yellow body, and Corpus albicans is known as white body. It is known as white body. So, now there are nearly 7 million primary oocytes in the female fetus, in the ovary of the female fetus. There are nearly 7 million primary oocytes in the ovary of female fetus. At the time of birth, 2 to 4 million are left. So during fetal life, there are 7 million. At the time of birth, number of primary oocytes left in the ovary are 2 to 4 million. But by puberty, only 60,000 to 80,000 primary oocytes are left. By puberty, only 60,000 to 80,000 oocytes are left. Suppose children, this is some sort of calculation. Suppose puberty starts at age of 11 and menopause occurs at the age of 51 years. What is start of puberty? That is start of menstruation cycle, which we'll discuss in the next lecture. So if puberty starts at 11 and menopause means stoppage of this menstrual cycle at 51 years. So for 40 years the eggs will be released. So reproductive life is of 40 years. Ovulation occurs only once in 1 month. Ovulation occurs, that is release of the egg from the ovary is alternate, and one ovary releases egg alternately in one egg in 1 month. In 1 year ovulation occurs 12 times. So in 40 years ovulation will occur 480 times, that is 480 oocytes will be released. So by the age of 51, very less number of oocytes, primary oocytes are left in the ovary due to regression. So in 40 years these oocytes will continue to regress, very less number of oocytes will remain in the ovary. Therefore reproductive life of the female is short, it is of only 40 years. Whereas male continues to form sperms till death. So in an average reproductive life of 40 years, in one female only 500, approximately 500 or 480 oocytes are released. Effective ovulation does not take place, therefore reproductive life of female ends after the age of 51 years. Here I have shown the diagram of ovum. This is the diagram of ovum. See, ovum has cytoplasm. It contributes cytoplasm to the zygote because sperm only contributes its nucleus or chromosomes, whereas egg contributes the cytoplasm as well. So ovum has, this is the polar body which is released, second polar body. Mitochondria. Mitochondria is contributed to the zygote by the ovum, and mitochondria is responsible for maternal inheritance. Nearly thousands of mitochondria. They will help in cleavage, and zygote will get mitochondria from maternal side. So it is also known as maternal inheritance. This is the secondary oocyte which will undergo meiosis II, which will complete its meiosis II after the arrival of the sperm. This is zona pellucida, which is glycoproteinaceous in membrane secreted by the secondary oocyte itself. The space between the membrane of secondary oocyte and zona pellucida is known as perivitellin space. The space between the cell membrane of secondary oocyte and zona pellucida is known as perivitellin space. On the periphery of the secondary oocytes, certain granules are present which are known as cortical granules. These cortical granules are filled with enzymes. These are filled with enzyme which we will discuss later on. Zona pellucida is covered by granulosa cells and they form a crown-like structure. These are forming a crown-like structure. Therefore, they are known as corona radiata. These corona radiata cells are derived from granulosa cell, जो ovum के साथ आ गए थे, means the cells which were attached during the release of the secondary oocyte to the ovum or secondary oocyte form the corona radiata. This is also very important. This diagram can also come in the exam. Thank you, students.